Hello and welcome back for the fifth and final MarshWatch webinar. So today we are going to be talking about a unique group of birds called rails, and we'll look at 5 different species. And we will also take a look at the 2 bitterns that you may encounter in your surveys. And these species are all MarshWatch or Marsh Monitoring Program target species. And then we will also have a look at the American toad for our final amphibian of the program. So the first rail that we are going to talk about is the sora. And if you don't know what a rail is, it's a small to medium terrestrial or semi-aquatic bird. So soras are small rails, and both sexes have a bright yellow bill, a black face mask and throat, an upturned tail with a little bit of white beneath it. They are mottled brown above, and they have a blue-gray belly. They are found in most wetlands with emergent vegetation. And looking at these pictures, they are quite distinctive and striking in their appearance, but they are secretive. So you are most likely to hear them rather than see them. And they have 2 particular calls or vocalizations that they make. The first is a descending horse-like whinny, which once you've heard that vocalization, you will never not know what that species is. It is one of the most unusual bird calls. And then they also have a 2-note per weep call, which starts with a lower note and then scoops up to a higher note. So the sora and its vocalizations are really unusual and probably its best defining feature. And it is a picker, so it essentially grabs up aquatic plant seeds, duckweed and pondweed, and various invertebrates from the surface of the water or from mud. And that's why it has that yellow bill with that particular pointy end that it can use to pick up these small prey items easily. And it breeds across Canada. Now, a bird that is similar in its general shape to the sora is the yellow rail. So again, it's pretty compact and it's a small rail. And it has a short yellow bill, so its bill is definitely shorter than that of the sora. And both sexes are kind of a streaky brown color with a dark stripe through the eye. And if you happen to see them in flight, they have a white wing patch, which you can see in the bottom right image here. Now, yellow rails are extremely secretive and they are exclusively nocturnal. So you are very unlikely to encounter them unless you go out into a wetland in the middle of the night or very, very early in the morning. And their habitat is shallow, sedgy, or grassy wetlands. And like the sora, the yellow rail is a picker, so it eats aquatic insects, terrestrial insects, seeds, and small snails is their most important prey item. And the song of the yellow rail is a combination of 2 notes followed by 3 notes, all on the same pitch, and it sounds a bit like tapping stones. So let's listen to that now. So again, because they are so secretive, you're most likely to hear this distinctive 2-3 combination rather than see the yellow rail. And it breeds across most of Canada, although if we're looking specifically at the Maritimes, it's most commonly found in New Brunswick rather than PEI and Nova Scotia. Now, another rail species that you're more likely to see than the yellow rail is the Virginia rail. The Virginia rail is larger than the Sora and the yellow rail, so it's more of a medium size, and it has a long, drooping red bill. So its bill is a lot longer than either the Sora or the yellow rail, and it has a short, upturned tail. Both sexes have a gray face, and they have kind of cinnamon, brown, warm tones on their body, and then black and white streaks on the flanks, so the back part of their sides. And like both the Sora and the yellow rail, the Virginia rail is pretty secretive and more often heard than seen, and it occupies wetlands with emergent vegetation, so a wetland that has Soras is also likely to have Virginia rails. And the vocalizations of the Virginia rail, it makes two particular calls. The first is a ticket, which sounds a little bit like an irregular broken turn signal. So again, the quality of that call is similar to a turn signal, but instead of that irregular rhythm, it's very irregular. And it also makes this pig-like grunting noise, which is very distinctive, and there are no other birds that sound like this. So you can hear in that call that it sort of starts more high-pitched, like squealing, a bit like a pig, or some people say like a chicken, and then it descends in pitch throughout the call. And the Virginia rail is a picker like the Sora and the yellow rail, but is also a prober, meaning it takes its bill and it sticks it down into the mud to look for prey. And that is why its bill is longer and thinner, because it needs to be able to probe through the soil and delicately find prey items. And it eats snails and slugs, insects, earthworms, amphipods, amphibians, and seeds of aquatic plants. So a wide variety of food found in wetland habitats. And it breeds across southern Canada. Now, a larger rail species that you may encounter is the American coot. So unlike the three rails that we saw previously, American coots are fairly bold and they act more like water chickens and less like the shy rails that we saw. And both sexes are black overall with white tail feathers and a bright white bill that has a slightly reddish tip. And it has a frontal shield that is white with a red callus. And it is common in most wetlands in its range. And it makes a pretty wide variety of chicken-like sounds and squeaks and squawks, as you can hear in this recording. And it is a surface feeder, so it pecks at the surface and it also dabbles like the mallard and the American black duck that we saw in our first ID session. It is omnivorous, so it eats plant matter throughout the year, for example, pondweeds and sedges, algae, and grasses. And when it has young or during the breeding season, it also eats invertebrates like insects, mollusks, and crustaceans. And it breeds in most of southern Canada. Our final rail species for today is the common gallinule, which is similar in appearance to the American coot in various ways. So it's a medium-sized rail. It's a little smaller than the American coot. It has a bright red bill with a yellow tip, a charcoal gray body, a white stripe down the side and white outer tail feathers, and then long green-yellow legs. And in particular, if you happen to come across a immature or juvenile, that white stripe down the side is the best identifying feature to know that it is a common gallinule rather than an American coot. And the vocalizations of the common gallinule are very similar to those of the American coot. So because those vocalizations are so similar, in the marsh monitoring program, we ask that you not try to distinguish the two species if you only hear them. So the best distinguishing features are physical features. And the common gallinule is found in freshwater and brackish marshes with a mixture of submerged, emergent, and floating vegetation. But they can also be found in human-made habitats like sewage lagoons and rice fields. And their diet is a mixture of vegetation, seeds, snails, and insects. And they like to feed on vegetation on or just below the surface. So again, that dabbling feeding style or pecking. And the common gallinule is much more common in the United States than it is in Canada. You can find it in southern Ontario and Quebec. And although the larger map here indicates that you do not find it in the Maritimes, this is not completely accurate. For example, this map shows you New Brunswick and a little bit of Nova Scotia and shows you that there are observations of this species in the Maritimes as well. So how can you best distinguish these two dark colored larger rail species? It can sometimes be tricky to remember which is which. So the first thing to look at is the bill color. So the American coot has a white bill with a darker tip, whereas the common gallinule has a bright red bill with a yellow tip. Another good feature is eye color. If you get a good look, the American coot has a red eye, whereas the common gallinule has a darker eye. The common gallinule has that distinctive stripe down the side, that white colored stripe. And this is present in all ages, so you can use it to identify juveniles as well. And the juvenile of the American coot is a sort of pale gray, whereas the juvenile of the common gallinule is dark gray below and brown on the back. Now, switching gears to bitterns. So the American bittern is a large heron. It has a compact body and a thick neck and relatively short legs in comparison to its body and its neck. Both sexes have streaky brown coloration and dark flight feathers. So you can see in the bottom right picture that the trailing edge or back edge of the wing, those feathers are dark. And they also have a black streak on the neck. And American bitterns exhibit cryptic behavior and coloration. So they like to pretend that they are a reed. So they will hide in dense vegetation that is fairly tall, and they will hold themselves very still. And in this way, they are able to blend in perfectly with their habitat. And so because they like to blend in this way, they're mostly found in large wetlands with that emergent vegetation. And their vocalizations, very little is known about the vocalizations of female bitterns, but the male American bittern has one of the most unusual calls or song. It's technically a song, it's an advertisement call for attracting mates. And it is often described with the mnemonic pumperlunk. It sounds maybe like water sloshing or a little bit like dripping. It's often also called booming. So let's take a listen to the boom of the bittern. So it's very deep and very echoey, and it carries for many kilometers. So again, because they are so good at camouflaging, you're most likely to hear that unusual call rather than see the bittern. And American bitterns are ambush predators, so they walk slowly through the marsh while swaying to imitate the motion of the reeds and the other vegetation. And then they use that sharp bill to stab or catch insects, amphibians, small fish, small mammals, and crayfish. And they nest in wetlands and in grasslands. And they breed across most of Canada. So again, they are migratory in the Maritimes. And finally, the other bittern that you may encounter in the Maritimes is the least bittern. It's a super small heron with a compact body and short legs. Again, a similar body profile to the much larger American bittern. Both sexes have contrasting color patterns, so they are darker on the back and lighter below. They have a warm orange toned body and an orange or buff colored wing patch, and then a streaked breast. So males have a dark blue back, scapular, and crown. You can see the male in the top image here. And the female has a brown back, scapular, and paler crown. And the female has darker stripes on the breast than the male. And again, similar to the American bittern, the least bittern prefers to hang out in large wetlands, and they like dense emergent vegetation and deep water, and they will often be found perching on reeds or cattails in these dense stands. And their diet is they peck from this dense vegetation. Again, they perch and then they peck at food that is located in the deep water below. And they actually, interestingly, sometimes build feeding platforms. And they will feed on small fish, insects, amphibians, and small mammals. And the vocalization is the males makes a sort of cooing sound, which you can hear in this recording. And the call or song, however you want to think about it, of the least bittern can in some ways be confused with the pie-billed grebe, but they are quite different. The least bittern, it only uses one note in its call, whereas the pie-billed grebe has a much more complex song. And so it's only really the front portion of the pie-billed grebe song that sounds a little bit like the least bittern. So again, this is the pie-billed grebe. this is the least bittern. And the least bittern is much more narrowly distributed in Canada. It's fairly rare, and in the Maritimes, it is restricted mostly to southern New Brunswick. So if you're just learning about bitterns now, you may be thinking, how can I keep these two species straight? So the first key distinguishing feature between the least bittern and the American bittern is size. So the least bittern is only slightly bigger than a robin, so it really is very, very tiny for a heron, whereas the American bittern is halfway between a crow and a goose, so it is more closer in size to other herons like great blue herons, for example. The least bittern has stripes on the neck and breast that are paler than the stripes on the American bittern. You can see the American bittern has much stronger brown stripes. And the least bittern has a dark cap and back and a paler front, whereas the American bittern is more uniformly brown, but it has that dark black neck stripe. So again, these two species are fairly different, but it's important to practice these identifications and also to get familiar with the vocalizations of these species, because you're more likely to hear them than see them. And our final amphibian for Maritimes MarshWatch is the American toad. So it is a large toad up to 11 centimeters long. And because it is a toad, it is very bumpy. It has these two-toned warts all over its body. It often has a line down the center of the back, you can see in the bottom left image. And the body color can be brown, reddish, or olive. And it is mostly found in terrestrial habitats, but it can sometimes be found near marshes or other wetlands. And the call is a lower intro note followed by a long, monotone, fairly high-pitched trill. And the trill is quite fast. So again, several bird species use trills as well, but the American toad trill is much faster than any of the bird trills that you may hear. So now that we've seen all of our species, I want to take a moment to review what we learned about in the 5 MarshWatch webinars. So we looked at waterfowl and shorebirds in the first ID session. We had a look at the Canada goose, which many of you are probably familiar with, as well as the mallard. We learned to distinguish the mallard and the American black duck. And we learned about the ringneck duck, which is the most distinctive of the waterfowl that we looked at. And then we also learned about 2 species of shorebird, the willet and the Wilson's snipe. And we met the pie-billed grebe. In our second ID session, we learned about common songbirds and other backyard birds. So we learned about the common yellowthroat and the yellow warbler and how those 2 species are different, and the difference between the warblers and the American goldfinch, primarily the beak shape, but also coloration. We looked at the American robin, which is a familiar backyard bird for many of you. And we learned about the American crow and particularly how to distinguish it from the common raven. And then we also covered the common grackle and the red-winged blackbird, 2 species that have very harsh and metallic sounding songs. And then our third ID session, we learned about 4 species of sparrow and how to tell the difference between these sparrows, particularly focusing on striking coloration. For example, the savanna sparrow with its yellow stripe over the eye, or the reddish crown and wings of the swamp sparrow, and the orange on the Nelson sparrow. But we also looked at the songs of those 4 sparrows and talked about the key features of each. And then we also encountered 4 other species: the marsh wren, the black tern, the tree swallow, and the cedar waxwing, each of which are quite distinctive in appearance and also in their calls. And then today we talked about those 5 species of rails and the 2 bitterns, and hopefully you got a sense of how to distinguish between these similar looking species or related species. And the amphibians that we covered, we looked at the wood frog, remembering that the most distinctive feature is the dark patch behind the eye, the spring peeper, which has an X on the back, the American bullfrog, which is the largest, and it has that fold behind the tympani, the green frog, which has various color patterns but always has these dorsolateral ridges, and then the American toad, which is best distinguished from these other amphibians by the warts, because it is a toad rather than a frog. And throughout the webinars, we talked about various plant species. We looked at sedges and the fact that they have very spiky flowers, and grasses. And we also looked at cattails, particularly focusing on their hot dog shaped flowers. And we learned about the differences between bulrushes and rushes, particularly that bulrushes are much larger, much taller than rushes. And we also looked at reeds, so the genus Phragmites, and we learned about the invasive and the native varieties. And we also covered several species of emergent plants. And we compared the differences between purple loosestrife and pickerel weed. They both have purple flowers in spikes, but the leaves are very different shapes. And we talked about arrowhead and buckbean and how their flowers are different. And of course, their leaves are also different. And we also looked at pickerel weed and cinquefoil and yellow sweet clover and horsetail. And for each of these species, again, we talked about distinctive features of the leaves and the flowers and their various habitats. So just to remind you before we finish up, of the 30 species of bird that we covered in the MarshWatch webinar series, 12 of them are primary or target species for the marsh monitoring program in the Maritimes. So the 5 rails that we covered today, the 2 bitterns that we covered today, and then the black tern, willet, pie-billed grebe, marsh wren, and Nelson sparrow. So if you are interested in getting involved with the marsh monitoring program, we recommend that you focus on those species in particular so that you are able to identify them out on your surveys. And that brings us to the end of our MarshWatch webinar series. Thank you so much for coming on this journey with us to learn about wetlands and about all of the different birds and amphibians and plants that you can find. If you are interested in joining the Maritimes MarshWatch or Marsh Monitoring Program, you can feel free to contact me. My email is again on the slide. You can also follow Nature NB and Birds Canada on our social media platforms, where you can get updates about various programs. We want to thank our supporters for allowing this program to go forward. And we wish you all the best as you go forward and start to put the skills that you have learned into practice in your local wetland.